In this video, I'm going to walk through how to use n8n Firecrawl and rss.app to scrape virtually any piece of web content and instantly transform it into LLM-ready output. Make sure to watch to the end to see the exact data pipeline we've used to generate SEO-friendly blog posts, automated newsletters, and all sorts of other content here at the recap. So right here, we're looking at a pretty simple automation that I built out inside of n8n that's going to be acting like a web scraping pipeline just for news-related content. The main goal of this automation is to scrape this content and package it up in a nice, clean, and easy to understand format that can be passed off to large language models and prompted against. This exact same automation can also be used to scrape any piece of content found on the internet, but for right now, we're going to get started by scraping against a Google News feed right here. So let's click Execute Workflow here to get this automation started. Right off the bat, we're going to see that this first node here is actually making a request, an HTTP request out to rss.app, which is going to be responsible for bundling up and gathering all of the news stories together that we actually want to scrape. So this is coming from a custom feed we set up with Google News. More on that later. We'll jump into this on the build out section. But for now, the biggest thing we're grabbing here is actually the URL of a story that we are trying to scrape from the newsfeed. After that gets done, we're doing a little bit of data cleanup and passing each of those stories into the secondary HTTP request node, which is going to be doing the heavy lifting here in our automation. So if I open this up, we can see that, we have 10 URLs coming into here, actually split up here into this item. And then on our output, if I show this data, we can see that we're spitting out Markdown out the other end that is later going to be used to get converted into a Markdown text file and then actually uploaded into the Google Drive folder we specified. So if I jump over here to Google Drive, we can see that each of those stories got spit out here. And if I open up one of these, let's grab news story number 6, open it up in text editor. We can see that this full story was actually extracted from the internet in clean, easy to read Markdown format. Let's run this automation again, but instead of going down the bottom path, let's use this blog OpenAI trigger to get started. Much like the other automation we ran, we're still going to make this initial request here using the HTTP node calling into rss.app. But instead, we got a different value here configured that's going to give us data back from the OpenAI blog. So if we look here underneath the items returned, we can see that the first one here is actually new tools and releases from the responses API. The second one here is this article on GPT-4o. And the third one is the introduction to Codex article. Each of these are actually coming straight from the OpenAI blog, and we're going to be able to look at that more a bit later. Going forward on the workflow, we're going to, again, clean out the data that has been set up here. So we go from that one list of articles to 17 different individual articles. And again, we are going to pass these all into our node here that is scraping data using the Firecrawl API. And so if we look through each of these responses and show them here, we can again see that under this Markdown value, we have that clean LLM-ready Markdown data getting passed back to us by only making that single HTTP call. Again, this merges into the same path from the previous workflow. And so we're going to see that that Markdown file gets created, and we're going to go ahead and upload that file to Google Drive for later use, prompting, or content creation if we want to. Let me jump back to Google Drive and grab one of these stories. And so if we go to story 3 here, open it up in our text editor, we can see that this is the exact article announcing the launch of OpenAI's Codex model, scraped and formatted in an LLM-ready Markdown format. That's going to be very easy for us to prompt against to create content or pull out links from if we need to expand and do later scraping in the future. Hey, just so you guys know, we're actually giving away this AI automation completely for free. Everything you need to run this, such as the n8n workflow file, all the prompts used, as well as the setup instructions, can all be downloaded from our free community called AI Automation Mastery. In order to join, just click on the very first link in the description of this video, go ahead and go over to the YouTube Resources tab, find the post that matches this video, and then you're going to be able to download this JSON file that contains everything you need to replicate this automation completely on your own. So now that you guys have seen the workflow end to end on both Google News and for capturing data and scraping OpenAI's blog, let's go ahead and extend this workflow even further to get us some robotics news scraped from the internet by piggybacking off of Google News and rss.app. The first thing I want to do here is actually switch over to a new tab, and let's bring up Google News. I'm going to go under Technology and then search for robotics to get a nice filtered list of articles and this full feed that I'm going to be able to eventually scrape from. So assuming that there's nothing weird looking here, all of these look to be related to robotics. And so I'm going to go forward with copying this URL from the browser and then jumping over to rss.app. This is like what we saw in both of the previous automation runs. This is going to be one of the backbones of the automation that's going to do the heavy lifting of pulling together all of those URLs that we need for our scraping pipeline. So I'm going to create a new feed, paste in that URL from Google News that we just built, and click on Generate. Once that is done, we can scroll through here quickly, make sure that everything looks like it matches what we want. Each of these look to be related to robotics, and so I think we're in a pretty good spot here. And so I'll go ahead and save this to my feed. And what we want to look for is this feed URL and make sure that we have this JSON option selected here. There's a couple of different other formats you can get this data in, but we really want to make sure we're using the JSON one for now. If you open this in a new tab, let me close out actually, copy this, and then open up the rss.app feed in a new tab, we can see that we're getting this exact same JSON that was being used in these previous runs of the automation. So this means we're in a good spot. So I'm going to go ahead, copy this JSON for now, and we'll get started wiring this up into the first step of this new pathway we want to build out. So in order to add in this new pathway, let's add in a new scheduled trigger. Go ahead and grab that in. Let's go every couple of hours. And then the next thing we need to do is actually go out and get this feed we just set up inside of rss.app. So again, with that copied, I'm going to go ahead and add in an HTTP request node. Make sure the method is set to get. You can keep everything else as it is. I'll paste that in, and so we see rss.app/feeds, and then you should see some random characters following here at the end that matches up with the RSS feed we just created. If I click execute this step, we should see that, yes, we have our Google News feed coming in, and then if you scroll down here to our items array, we should be seeing a bunch of robotic stories. And so this looks good. ABB, reportedly exploring $3.5 billion sale. Robotics. Everything's looking good to match what we set up in our brand new feed. So that kind of covers it for the first part of our automation that is going to be responsible for capturing and getting that list of news stories we need to scrape for our news article scraper. Moving on to the next part, we do need to do a little bit of data cleanup in order to get our result of this HTTP request in a clean, easy to use state for our secondary API call that actually passes into the Firecrawl API. Pretty simple. What we're going to do is be using what is called the split out node. Basically lets us turn one item into a list of items that can be passed into a follow-up node. If you guys remember when we were scraping Google News before, there's 10 different articles that had to get split out into their own items. So we're going to be doing that exact same thing here. So I'll drag that in, make sure we're connected up. And if I go to this node, all we want to do here is look for the list of items we want to split. And so we have our data here coming from the previous rss.app HTTP request. What we want to do is grab this list of items and drag that in here to split out. So if I hit execute step, we should see that we're going from one to many different items getting split out here. 50 is a lot for now. If you need to change this, if you go under your feed output, you can lower this to something smaller for testing, like 2 to 3, really just depending on whatever your needs are. I'll lower this for now. So then if we do another test, pin this by clicking P, and then split out again, we will get those 3 items returned back to us. A little bit easier and faster to iterate on while we're building this. The next thing we need to do is actually hook this into our Firecrawl API request. This is something, just for the sake of simplicity in this integration or for this workflow, I'm just going to drag it up here and it's going to work exactly as it needs to. But if you're building this out for the first time yourself, let's jump into this node to really walk through what is going on here. So I think the first thing to cover is like, what is Firecrawl? What is it actually doing? Firecrawl is this API provider that allows you to send HTTP requests to their system, and they will return back pretty much whatever you need in terms of ready-to-use data for LLMs. What we're making use of in our automation is what's called their scrape endpoint. And so if we actually jump into the dashboard and then look at their docs, we can see a little bit more about what scrape is actually doing. So turning the URL into clean data, what the Firecrawl API is doing is converting web pages into Markdown, which is, again, an ideal format for LLM applications or any other prompting you want to do off of that content that you're fetching. And so when we're using the Firecrawl API, it's actually pretty simple for us to get this data back in a clean spot. The first thing we need to do here is actually make sure we're changing our HTTP method to post from this dropdown, and making sure that the URL we're sending this request to is this v1 scrape endpoint off of the api.firecrawl.dev domain. I'm going to skip over the authorization for 1 second. We'll jump back to this, but then I'm going to come down further here on how to actually structure this request. Everything you see here, all of these parameters do live on the Firecrawl API documentation. I'll make sure to link that. But if we go to API reference, scrape, we can see how exactly all of the parameters that need to get used to build up this request. There's a lot here. Not all of this is needed. And so I'm going to jump back to my example that gives more of a simple approach to getting the data you need for your request. The first thing to cover here is using this specify headers. Make sure you select using fields below, pass in content type, and give it the value application/JSON. If you go to the Firecrawl docs, this is something that you should be able to copy from right here. So content type, applicant JSON, you're able just to copy and paste that into this send headers field right here. The next part is the most important part, because this is going to be how we actually interact with the Firecrawl API and tell it what web page we actually want to scrape. And so when building this up, make sure you're selecting body content type using JSON from the list here, specify body using JSON, and then let's click expression here under JSON and blow this up so we can see everything that's going on. The first part we need to actually cover here is what is going to be the URL, or what web page on the internet are we trying to scrape. By passing in curly brackets json.url, we're actually telling n8n that we want to take each of the URLs that were split out here and fetch those individually as the automation is running. So as we know, we click through this, we can see that we are dynamically swapping in the URL that we want to scrape for this news article on every single item that we split out. That's why it's so important for us to come back here and actually clean up this data before we go forward. Otherwise, you may only get one news article when there's dozens that you could be scraping from and saving your content for. The next big thing to cover is actually this formats parameter. That is going to be what we do to set up what needs to come back from the API. If you read the docs here, they have more writing about all of this, but I will give you the brief overview here. For our use case, we want to make sure that we always have this markdown value included. I like to specify raw HTML and links just because their API will give that back to us separately. So if we want to save the HTML file for later processing down the road, we're able to do so. And links is nice because we get a big list of links that are actually going to be saved with us. And so if we have like some researching agent or somebody on our content marketing team who wants to dig into the news article a little bit further, those links are going to be provided with us. JSON is a special one here that I'll cover a little bit at the end, so let's ignore that one for now. Going forward to the next part is this parameter called exclude tags. This is something that's just a little bit of an optimization that helps nudge Firecrawl and lets them know what parts of the web page should be excluded when you're scraping. For the use case that I'm working through right now, we don't really care about things like the navigation bar, the header, the footer. That's just like extra tokens and extra processing that's going to take the API to actually run through to scrape. And so we are just adding these in as something to exclude so we can get more accurate data back even faster. Only main content, this is something I like to set as true when working with Firecrawl. I found that it just really helps kind of avoid some of those excessive text that you may see on a web page, whether if it's like a sidebar that's like hazy, if it could be the main content or not the main content. I like to leave this as true when working with Firecrawl for that reason. Finally, the last part I want to cover is this JSON options field. This is a bit more complex and really isn't going to apply to everybody using Firecrawl, but I think it's worth covering here for this specific use case that we're working through. By giving JSON options and a prompt here, let me highlight this. This is really an opportunity for us to actually give Firecrawl a prompt in plain English that is telling other information we want their AI to extract while they're processing a web page. And so for the sake of the use case that I'm working on, I have this prompt included that says, identify the main content of the text, i.e. the article or newsletter body, provide the exact text for the main content verbatim without summarizing or rewriting any part of it. And that goes on a little bit further. But the goal of this is to take what they're doing with, this only main content property that we're passing in. And I want to take this a little bit further because I found that after scraping, hundreds, if not thousands of web pages, there's still some kind of junk that appears even if you do specify only main content as being true. So by giving this prompt here and actually specifying that we want this string value as an output of this API call to Firecrawl, we're able to get a more condensed version that has all of the excessive, promotional text or call to action copy or any buttons that appear on the web page excluded from our final result. And so this is totally optional. You don't have to provide JSON options here when you're working through scraping, but I would encourage you to experiment with it as you're working through and building your own automations. The other important thing to note here is that using JSON options and giving a prompt will make each API request that you make to Firecrawl a little bit more expensive. And so that's something also to consider for whatever use case you're working through. Make sure that you are actually doing that math in your head on, is the cleaner output data worth that trade-off? We'll be sure to include this prompt in this full JSON body here for you to copy paste in if you want. That'll also be included in the template as well as we proceed. So the last thing that I want to cover here with the HTTP request node and making calls to the Firecrawl API is going to be setting up authentication. This is something that will be required when you're trying to work with the Firecrawl API. If you don't do this, you're going to get 401 errors appearing all over the place. So let's go ahead and set this up from scratch so you guys can do this on any workflows that you're building with Firecrawl. So before we get started, the first place to always look for dealing with authentication or authorization is going to be on the documentation page of whatever API you're looking at. So if I go back to our scrape endpoint, we can see right away that they have this authorizations and authorization section covered right here that gives us a little bit of a hint on how to set this up. So if I see this authorization, this is a string, it's a header, and it's required on all of our requests. And basically, it is a bearer authentication header in the form of bearer space token, where token is your auth token. To put that in more plain English, basically every single request that we're sending to the Firecrawl API, we are required to add this header with bearer space our token, which is our API key, included in that request. So let's jump into it and build this together. So let's go ahead and copy authorization, because this is going to be the name of the header that we are required to pass in. And since it says it is an authentication header, that's another hint of what we need to do next. So under authentication, let's go ahead and actually choose generic credential type. Go ahead and select header auth, as that's what was noted under the API docs. And let's go ahead and create a new credential. This is the way I would suggest that you always work with API keys and secrets in n8n. Otherwise, you could go ahead and put this underneath this header param area, but you will be putting your API key just in plain text. And then anytime you're actually, need to make up a follow-up HTTP request or use that API, you got to remember to copy and paste everything over. And so if we create a credential this way, we will store our API key in one single spot, and it will be easy for us to reuse over any number of automations and AI-enabled workflows that we're building in the future. So just save yourself the headache. Go ahead and create this credential, even though there's a bit more steps in the beginning. So I'm going to create this credential. Let's go ahead and call this Firecrawl test. And we're going to paste in authorization, because according to the docs, that is the name of the header we're required to use. So we see that right here. If we also look here where it says curl, we can see that the header is being specified. Before this colon is going to be the name of the header, which matches what we pasted in. And then the second part is going to be where we actually configure our API key. They're using something called bearer token auth. And so what this means is we have to grab bearer. We'll copy that, paste this in, hit space, and then we need to go back to Firecrawl and actually grab our API key. And so I have an account set up already. You're able to go ahead and get free credits, but you will need an account to actually get your own API key. So once you have your account set up on Firecrawl, go to API keys, go to default or create your own key. Let's go ahead and copy this, come back to n8n, and paste this in. And so the format that we have set up here is authorization is the name, value is bearer, like exactly as it was detailed on the docs, space, and then we paste in our API key. So that should be good. I'm going to go ahead and save Firecrawl test right here. We should get that green confirmation. And make sure that we have Firecrawl test actually selected here, or whatever you name this, underneath header auth. So the reminder, authentication should be generic credential type. Generic auth type should be header auth, because that's what the Firecrawl docs mentioned. And then we want to select the name of the new credential we just created here. So if I hit execute step again, if we did this correctly, we should not see any errors that come up. This should actually go ahead and start scraping these three items that were just passed in from our robotics our robotics newsfeed that we just set up. Excellent. That just finished up. We got the green notification that came here at the bottom. If I open this up, we can see our stories appearing here, where we have this ABB reportedly exploring $3.5 billion sale of robotics business. And that means we have our markdown scraped successfully from that API call into Firecrawl. All right, so now that we have the markdown content actually scraped from the Firecrawl API, The last two things we need to do here for our automation is actually convert that markdown text content into a markdown file and upload that file to Google Drive. So let's dive in. The first thing we need to do here is actually create this file itself. For this, we are using I'll pull it up here, convert to file node, which allows us to take this JSON data that was extracted from Firecrawl and create a real file that can be processed later. So if I open this up, we're using the operation convert to text file because markdown is simply another form of text. And we need to pass in the path to whatever field we want to get written to the file. And so this says data.json. This means that we are looking here at the result of our scrape operation, and we are going to data. And if I scroll down here, we will see our JSON that appears also below. This is kind of getting back to the point I made earlier where you have the option to pass in either this JSON options value or not. I am using data.json in my convert to markdown node because I do have this prompt running here. If you opt to not do that, you can change this to data.markdown, and that is going to actually still work the same, but will then point to the markdown that Firecrawl gave back to us. So really your choice depending on how you want to set this automation up. But let's go forward now with a more simple option just by using data.markdown. Data will just remain the same here as a default, easy to work with, and is kind of the standard convention within n8n. And then finally, I opted just to rename each of the files here so we can differentiate the stories from each other. On this one, we can see that I'm just doing new story underscore and giving an expression here for the item index +1. So if I have 10 different stories that are getting scraped in one run, we'll have new story number 1, new story number 2, so on and so forth. That pretty much covers it here for creating our markdown file. And then once we jump into the last step here for uploading our markdown file to Google Drive, all we have to do is go under our credential that we set up for Google Drive. I won't get into that because the setup here right now is a little bit more extensive than what's required for Firecrawl. Maybe we'll do a separate video on that if you're interested. Under resource, make sure you have file selected. Under operation, make sure you have upload selected to create that file on Google Drive, and leave this as the default here for data. This basically means that we're looking for the data field that is the output of this convert to file operation. So if this says data and this says data, every single file that you pass through from this node to this node will be able to be processed. And then finally, if I just run this again so we can get some example data populating, we are building an expression here that's grabbing the name of the file we've set. So underneath the file name, we'll be able to see in our Google Drive folder, new story number 1, new story number 2, new story number 3, as each of these files get processed. So that's how you're able to pass that data through, by making sure you have this set to expression and you use binary.data.filename. And in terms of where you're saving the file, this is completely your choice, where what parent drive you want the file to get uploaded to and what folder you want it to get uploaded to. And that covers it here for our automation to take all of these news stories scraped from the internet, process it into a markdown file, and then upload it to Google Drive. All right, before we wrap up here, I want to give you guys a sneak peek of what a real production AI-enabled workflow looks like that a real business is using. Goal of this is to kind of get your guys' gears turning and see what the art of the possible is for using a workflow like this in your personal life or in your own business. This automation we have here is kind of the brain of the data ingestion operations we have going at the recap for our AI newsletter. So as you guys can see here, we have a bunch of different paths set up very similar to the automation we were building together that are running through the system and picking up news articles from a ton of different sources. And so we can see that we have hooks into place for, NVIDIA blog, Google blog, Anthropic's blog. We have scrapers in place for all different stories shared to Reddit on Hacker News. Of course, we have the Google News trigger that's capturing sources from all of the major publications, and that all gets fed into this centralized store that we've set up, a little bit different from Google Drive, but similar in many different ways. And so what we do on each of these stories is we give each story an identifier that we can later reference in our content pipeline, and we build that up as it flows through the rest of our system. And so after we scrape something, we're setting that identifier on the story. And the first thing we're going to do in order to, avoid wasting or using excessive scraping credits is going to be searching our S3 bucket to look and see if we already have this story scraped and saved in our system. When you're doing more scraping at scale, this is going to be something that gets pretty expensive the more you do it. And so we want to avoid wasting resources here, even if we are only scraping, every couple of hours or so. So that runs. We're going to go ahead and skip over anything that we have already saved in our system. And much like the integration, much like the workflow that we built out together, we're again going to go ahead and scrape the URL that gets passed into it. We have this extra filter set up here in case there's any errors that go on, just due to the sheer number of scraping operations that are running. There's occasionally going to be errors that happen where a website's inaccessible, or there's kind of the cat and mouse game going on where scrapers get blocked, and we're not able to always get that. So we still want this workflow to run, for the stories we are able to grab. And so we're going to filter those out and keep on going through the pipeline. The next step that happens here is a little bit of where you can sprinkle in AI and more LLM calls to automate parts that a human may be doing manually. So right here, we have this prompt set up that's actually going to evaluate the content to make sure that it is truly relevant to our something that our audience would be interested in reading about, and if it's truly related to AI. And so if there's stories that are coming from a source like on Reddit that's potentially overly political or something that really isn't related to AI at all, we want to go ahead and filter that out. And so we're just using one of the many AI models to do a quick scan of that and purge out anything that we don't care about. So that's this node combined with this filter. Finally, we have this other operation going, which is a little bit of an enrichment process to the content we've scraped to try and pull out any source links, external source links that were found in the article itself. And so, if we're scraping something that's a big announcement from a new AI model that was released and they're linking out to a research paper, we want to have that research paper as a source we can also scrape to in the future. And so this is a simple extraction prompt we're running to pull out a list of those extra URLs that can get saved as metadata for later. After that's done, with all of this information combined together, and so instead of uploading to Google Drive, we're saving this to one of our S3 storage buckets because it's just easier for us to programmatically access and use in other systems that we're building. All right, guys, that's it for this video. Hope you all found it helpful and will be able to apply what you learned to the future in different automations you're building out for your own business. Like I mentioned before, you can actually download the full n8n automation template, each of the prompts used, and all of the setup instructions needed for the automation by joining our free community called AI Automation Mastery. All you got to do to join is click on that very first link in the description of this video, and you're going to be able to get access to all of that. Finally, make sure you go ahead and click that like and subscribe button below, as we're going to be releasing a ton of more AI automation tutorials and AI automation content in the near future. This includes things like tutorials on automating how you create SEO articles, actually making social media agents for your business, and creating AI sales agents. So join the community, leave a comment below, and we'll see you next time.